Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. It's the Munroe Center for Social Inquiry's pleasure to welcome Dr. Kathryn Olmsted. Now, she received her bachelor's degree in history from Stanford University and her master's and PhD from the University of California at Davis. She's been working at UC Davis since 1993, where she currently serves as a professor in the Department of History. In her research, Dr. Olmsted explores the proliferation of anti-communist thought within 20th century conservatism within the United States. Her publications include an analysis of the right wing's critique of FDR's New Deal, the post-Watergate attempts to reform the CIA and FBI, and of course, conspiracy theories. Her 2009 book, titled Real Enemies, Conspiracy Theories and American Democracy, World War I to 9/11, provides a compelling account of a century when the precise notion of the American conspiracy theory changed. We saw in this time period that conspiracy theorists began to no longer question the other, but began to question the familiar and the powerful, most notably the US government. In this misinformation age, it can be exceedingly difficult to filter through information and separate the fact, the fiction, and the questionable. Her perspective as a historian allows for a factual, in-depth analysis of conspiracy theories that continue to entertain, puzzle, and aggravate the nation. Her work is truly outstanding for both the skeptic and the loyalist alike. So without further ado, to present her talk entitled, Just Because You're Paranoid Doesn't Mean They're Not Out to Get You, Anti-Government Conspiracy Theories Throughout American History, we welcome Dr. Kathryn Olmsted.
All right, thank you, Desiree, for that very nice introduction. Thank you, Brian, for inviting me. And thank all of you for taking time out from your busy schedules to come hear this talk. I am honored to be part of this speaker series on conspiracy theories because I think it's a very important topic and I think it's essential for understanding our current political environment. So I think, unfortunately, it's a very current topic at the moment. What I want to do today is talk a little bit about, first of all, how I got interested in researching anti-government conspiracy theories, and then talk a little bit about what I bring to this study as a historian, how what I do is different from other social sciences, and then finally go through my area of specialty, which is the rise in anti-government conspiracy theories since the 1960s. But first of all, let me tell you a little story about how I got interested in this subject. So about 20 years ago, I published my first book. It was the result of my dissertation research, and it was called Challenging the Secret Government, the Post-Watergate Investigations of the CIA and FBI. And it was about the investigations by Congress and the press of the CIA and FBI right after Watergate. So after Nixon resigned, there had been a great deal of concern that perhaps there were other government abuses and crimes that Americans hadn't learned about. And the most prominent of these investigations in the 1970s was called the Church Committee. It was a select Senate committee that examined the history of the FBI and the CIA, going all the way back to the beginning of the Cold War. And it was the Church Committee that uncovered a lot of the abuses and crimes that we know about that were committed by the CIA and FBI. It was the Church Committee that documented that the CIA had been trying to kill foreign leaders, that the CIA had been trying to kill Fidel Castro for many years and was using the mafia to do it, for example, that the FBI had been spying on Martin Luther King, that the FBI had a surveillance program called COINTELPRO that kept tabs on American dissidents, that the NSA had a substantial surveillance program. All right, so I published this book. It was my dissertation. I published it with the University of North Carolina Press, which does not sell in airport bookstores. Right? And I was at that time an adjunct teaching an occasional class at the University of California, Davis. I wasn't even allowed to use the copy machine. I didn't have an office. I would squat in other people's offices when I was teaching a class, right? So I give you this context to let you know that I was not a high-profile academic, right? This was not a high-profile book. I was not easy to find, but people started finding me. I started getting letters in my cubbyhole at UC Davis from people who had sent me these envelopes that were bulging with newspaper stories that they had highlighted in yellow highlighter. And I started getting phone calls. Even though I didn't have my own office, people would call the History main office and they would patch me through to whatever office I was sitting in that day. And these people reached out to me because they read everything there was to read about the Church Committee, because they wanted to know about government conspiracies, because they believed they were victims of government conspiracies. And I discovered there was this whole subculture out there. Many, many Americans who believed that they had been victims of conspiracies by the CIA and FBI. And some of these phone calls would start out very rationally and sometimes end very rationally, where people had been in anti-war groups in the 1960s and believed that they had been victimized by COINTELPRO or had been surveilled by the CIA as part of its illegal domestic surveillance program. Sometimes people would tell me that they were victims of CIA mind control experiments and that they needed help finding a dentist who didn't deny that they had transmitters in their molars. But the most bizarre phone call that I received was from a woman who called me one day and said she was calling from a payphone in Sacramento. She was passing through town, and she had read a story in the local alternative weekly about my book. Her boyfriend, she said, was a former CIA agent who was trying to blow the whistle on incompetence in the CIA. They had put him on administrative leave, they weren't listening to him, and now they were fleeing from the CIA across the country. They were stopping at this phone booth in Sacramento. They read the story, and they wanted to know, what should they do? What was my advice? Should they turn themselves into the FBI? And so I just wanted to get this woman off the phone. And so I said, yeah, you should turn yourself into the FBI. That sounds like the right thing to do. Yes, totally, you can trust them. Later, she sent me a letter that had the name of her boyfriend and all of the details of his alleged activities that I filed in a very thick file I had at the time that I labeled Letters from Wackos, not very sensitively. And then I didn't think about it for another couple years. And then I was having dinner at a friend's house, and we were in the kitchen making dinner, and my friend's husband came in and said, Kathy, there's a story on the evening news you might be interested in. The FBI has just arrested a CIA agent who's claiming he's a whistleblower. They say he's guilty of extortion. So I went out and looked, and it was the woman's boyfriend, right? She had been telling me the truth. And in fact, they finally had turned themselves into the FBI, and the FBI had then arrested them. Right? And he later went to prison for 4 years and then wrote a lot of articles about his experiences. All right, so this story, this experience, sort of confirmed a lot of beliefs that I already had about conspiracy theories and anti-government conspiracy theories. The chief one being that you shouldn't label someone who says the government is out to get them as a wacko, because the government might be out to get them. Right? And I became very interested in the relationship between real government conspiracies and conspiracy theories about the government, and how it was that the revelation of real government abuses and crimes, especially during the 1970s, but since then as well, led to conspiracy theories about the government. And I became interested in understanding how the revelation of these real crimes and conspiracies would lead to conspiracy theories. And that doesn't mean that I believe these conspiracy theories. It's just I want to get inside the heads of the people who believe them and understand why they would, given this documentary evidence that there have been real conspiracies committed by the government. And so that's what I do that's different as a historian, I think, than social scientists. I look in archival repositories, I look at primary sources, and then I seek to put these conspiracy theories in historical context and understand what it is about that particular time, about what people knew and were learning at that time, that would lead them to have conspiracy theories about the government, especially as the government gets more and more secretive and does commit real conspiracies. Why would people believe conspiracy theories about it? Now, the historian Richard Hofstadter had a concept that I find very useful for studying this field. He said that conspiracy theorists make a big leap from the undeniable to the unbelievable. And this is what I'm interested in, is how conspiracy theorists take amass all this undeniable evidence of government conspiracy and then make that big leap from the undeniable to the incredible. Okay, but first of all, let's now turn to looking precisely at how these anti-government conspiracy theories have spread since the 1960s. Okay, so here is a graph showing the ups and downs of Americans' trust in government since 1964, going up to 2014. All right, so there's a series of polls called the National Election Series that's very useful for studying change over time in American attitudes towards government. Because since 1958, they've been asking the same question. So you can really look at how American attitudes change over time. And they have asked, do you trust the US government to do the right thing all of the time, most of the time, some of the time, or never? And there was a time in the not too distant past, about 50 years ago, in the mid-60s, when 2/3 of Americans said that they trusted their government to do the right thing most of the time. This was at the height of the liberal consensus, the Cold War, Great Society, and 2/3 of Americans, they paid their tax dollars, and they trusted the government to do the right thing with those tax dollars. Right? And then you can see there starts to be this precipitous fall. And there's a steady fall really from the 60s to the 90s, and then it's sort of all over the place, but it's currently at about 20% of Americans who say they can trust their government to do the right thing most of the time. Right? So there are a lot of reasons for this number to fall in these years. The Vietnam War, obviously. But also, another important event that I think helps to explain the collapse of trust in government in the 60s and 70s is the Kennedy assassination and the government investigation of the Kennedy assassination. So let me talk a little bit about that, because I think this is one of the first pivotal events in this collapse of government since trust and trust in government since the 1960s. All right, so John Kennedy was assassinated in Dealey Plaza in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. So you can see this in historical terms as an intelligence failure by the U.S. government. The intelligence agencies of the U.S. government failed to predict and stop this assassination of the president. So intelligence failures always lead to conspiracy theories. Pearl Harbor, JFK assassination, 9/11. But the Kennedy assassination also had other elements that really lent themselves to conspiracy theorizing. First of all, almost immediately after the assassination, the police found a sniper's nest in a warehouse overlooking Dealey Plaza. The rifle in the sniper's nest was owned by this man, Lee Harvey Oswald. It had his palm print on it. About an hour afterwards, he was seen shooting to death a Dallas police officer who was seeking to question him about the assassination. He was then taken into custody, and for the next 2 days, he was interviewed by the police and the FBI. Right? But then, 2 days after John Kennedy's assassination, Oswald was shot to death by this man, Jack Ruby, in the Dallas jail. Jack Ruby may or may not have had ties to the mafia, depending on which book you read. Right? So immediately after this happened, of course, a lot of Americans start suspecting a conspiracy. You know, was Oswald part of a bigger conspiracy? Was he then silenced by the conspirators? Now, one of the people who believes in a conspiracy is actually the president, Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson told several people that he thought that Fidel Castro might have killed John Kennedy for the very good reason that John Kennedy was trying to kill Fidel Castro at the same time. Kennedy's CIA had several assassination plots against Fidel Castro. They tried to shoot him, stab him, blow him up, put a deadly fungus in his diving suit, poison his chocolate milkshake, and they hired mafia people to carry out these plots. All right, so Johnson actually personally believed that there might be a conspiracy, but he decided immediately that it was dangerous for the American people to believe in a conspiracy. And so he decided to appoint an investigation that would determine that Oswald acted alone. In other words, he decided to have an investigation that was not really an investigation. And so he started calling in members of this Blue Ribbon Commission he was going to set up, starting with the Chief Justice of the United States, Earl Warren, to ask them to serve on this investigation. And we know what Johnson was thinking at this time because he recorded a lot of his conversations. And here is a transcript of a conversation where he is explaining how he got Earl Warren to serve on this investigation, the Chief Justice of the United States. So he gets the Chief Justice in the Oval Office. The Chief Justice does not want to do this. I mean, would you? He does not want to serve on this investigation. And so then Johnson tries to strong-arm him into being part of the investigation. And he says, now there's all kinds of conspiracy theories. Now these wild people are charging Khrushchev killed Kennedy and Castro killed Kennedy and everybody else killed Kennedy. Now we've had 60 FBI agents working for 7 days and they've got the story and they've got the fingerprints and they've got everything else. But the American people in the world have got to know who killed Kennedy and why, and somebody's got to evaluate that report. And if they don't, why, if Khrushchev moved on us, he could kill 39 million in an hour. But say no if you want to, it's fine. Right? So Johnson believed that there were very high stakes with this investigation, with these conspiracy theories. That if Americans believed that there was some sort of Soviet or Cuban conspiracy to kill the president, as he himself actually believed, that then he might be forced to invade Cuba, or there could be some sort of tense nuclear standoff, perhaps nuclear war. And so he said, I want this to stop. No more conspiracy theories. You have this investigation, and I'm telling you what I want you to find. This guy did it, and he did it alone. And so that's what the Warren Commission did. Now, this report that said that Oswald acted alone was a little successful at the beginning. So here is a graph of the percentage of people who believed in a JFK conspiracy theory. Starting in 1964, the last poll was in 2013 at the 50th anniversary, right? So you can see it's never a negligible amount. Even after the Warren Commission comes out, it's more than 45% of the American people. But it does go down a little bit. But then what happens is starting in 1966, it starts to rise. And it begins to get really high in the 1970s. And the reason for this is that there are many best-selling books that come out that posit a conspiracy in the Kennedy assassination. And there are sort of dribs and drabs of information that come out into the public about Kennedy's plots against Castro. And none of this is verified, but a lot of people, if you're reading the newspaper, you can learn that Kennedy's CIA was trying to kill Castro, Oswald was a communist, the mafia was involved. Is there some sort of conspiracy? Was the Warren Commission really just a whitewash? And so people start to ask these questions. Now, this really disturbs a lot of officials in the US government. And in fact, the CIA in 1967 writes a memo that later becomes very notorious, it's secret at the time, about how dangerous these conspiracy theories are. It says the whole reputation of the US government is at stake. These conspiracy theorists are ruining the reputation of the government, of the CIA. The government is not going to be able to act unless the government quashes these conspiracy theories. So they're very worried about the effects of this. Right now, their plan of action is to sort of talk to the media, so it's not very effective. All right, so all of this is going on in the late 60s, early 70s. The next big blow to Americans' faith in the government is the Watergate scandal. This is a picture of the Watergate buildings. So in 1972, 5 burglars were arrested at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate building. And it turned out that they all had connections to the committee to re-elect the president. They had the highest tech electronic surveillance equipment on them at the time. Right. Now, over the next 2 years, more and more information comes out about this. And the important thing to remember about Watergate and the Watergate scandal is it wasn't just the one burglary. That's the one where they got caught. There were dozens of other burglaries by this same group. And even more significant is that they were being paid by money that was raised by the committee to re-elect the president through bribery and extortion of various rich individuals and corporate leaders. All right, so when these guys get caught, the president immediately realizes it is a huge problem. Because if all the burglaries are discovered, if this whole program that is run by the committee to re-elect the president to sabotage and spy on the Democrats is revealed, if all of the money is traced to its source, well, his administration is going to fall. So he starts the cover-up, right? And a lot of people at the beginning don't believe that the highest aides to the president, let alone the president himself, are involved. This is a conspiracy theory at the time, but by 1974, it is shown to be an actual conspiracy, right? A proven conspiracy. Most notably, when the Watergate tapes are released, especially what becomes known as the smoking gun tape, where the president can be heard telling his chief of staff just days after the Watergate break-in to use the CIA to pressure the FBI to stop its investigation. Obstruction of justice, right? Once this tape becomes public, Nixon's support just evaporates. He has to resign. Now, from the point of view of the history of conspiracy theories, this is really an epic moment because this is when a lot of Americans are stunned to discover there's this real evidence that their president had been involved in this secret conspiracy for years, and that he was trying to use the secret agencies of the U.S. government to make sure that his own wrongdoing was not discovered. So, after Watergate, after Nixon's resignation, there are a lot of calls in Congress. You have this very assertive post-Watergate, democratically controlled Congress that says, let's get to the bottom of this. What else is going on that we don't know about? And so, in the 1970s, there are all of these investigations, including the one that I talked about, that I wrote a book about, this church committee in the Senate. Here's a boring picture of a bunch of guys around a table, but this is the church committee, right? So for 15 months, with 70 staff members, subpoena power, a huge budget, this Senate committee decided to investigate the history of the CIA and FBI because of Watergate, because of the way Nixon tried to manipulate those agencies into participating in the cover-up in Watergate, to see if there was anything else we needed to know about in their history. So the church committee required CIA officials, FBI officials to come testify. They got all these secret documents, and then they started releasing reports, official government reports, like this one with the very dull title, Alleged Assassination Plots Involving Foreign Leaders, which really is a history of CIA attempts to kill people, right? Especially heads of state in other countries, most notably Fidel Castro. And perhaps the most explosive part of this report was the way the CIA had used the mafia to try to kill Castro. Even though at that very moment, the FBI had lots of these godfathers on its 10 most wanted list, the CIA was meeting with them in secret to encourage them to try to kill Castro. And they were going along with it because they wanted their casinos in Cuba back. Right. So in addition to the CIA activities, the Church Committee also looked at the history of the FBI, where J. Edgar Hoover had been director for almost 50 years. He had died in 1972. And they discovered things like that the FBI had been systematically spying on Martin Luther King for years to try and discredit him. And that they had gotten this dossier together of dirt on him, which contained alleged evidence of his extramarital affairs, and then shopped it all around to journalists. And here's the table of contents from the report of what they did to Dr. King. Attempts to discredit Dr. King with the Congress, attempts to discredit Dr. King with universities, attempts to discredit Dr. King with churches, attempts to discredit Dr. King with the Pope. And in addition to this, they had put together a tape that they thought would shock King and sent it to him, an audio tape, with a cover letter that here is the version of the letter that was released in 1976 by the Church Committee. You can see that some of it was still redacted. Recently, the whole thing was released, where they tell him what a terrible person he is, how he's going to be exposed, and how he should apparently kill himself. King took this to be an instruction to kill himself, or they would release all this information on him. You are done. There is but one way out for you. You better take it before your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is bared to the nation. So the Church Committee has all of this. It has the assassination plots. It has CIA mind control experiments. No, it has NSA surveillance. All of these in official government reports. Now, the Church Committee also has a big effect on the number of people who believe in JFK assassination theories. Because once people learn about the Castro plots, how Kennedy's CIA had been in charge of trying to work with mafia to kill Castro, they start to believe that perhaps Castro killed Kennedy, or perhaps the mafia killed Kennedy, or perhaps anti-Castro Cubans killed Kennedy. I mean, the list goes on and on. And is captured, I think, in this Onion front page, so that by the late 70s, really no one knows what to believe. And there's one poll that asked people if they believe in the official government explanation of the Kennedy assassination and the official government explanation of the Martin Luther King assassination. Only 5% of Americans believe in both explanations, right? So 95% of Americans by the late 70s believe that their government might have been involved in killing at least one national hero. All right. And of course, it doesn't stop with the Church Committee. In the 1980s, there's the Iran-Contra scandal. Congress passed a law prohibiting the US government from aiding a counter-revolutionary army in Nicaragua, the Contras, but the Reagan administration kept on aiding them anyway, and then secretly approached the government of Iran, started selling them missiles, again contrary to US law, so that to get their help in getting hostages out of Lebanon, and then took the profits from these arms sales and diverted them down to Nicaragua. Right? It's a very complicated scandal, but Americans could understand one part of it, and that was that clearly Reagan administration officials were lying. You know, they had said they were tough on terrorists. Secretly, they were paying this ransom. You know, they were not abiding by the laws passed by Congress. And so this begins even more disillusionment. Of course, people on the left are disillusioned. What's interesting about Iran-Contra is there's also increasingly this fringe on the right that is becoming very anti-government. Even though you would think that Reagan would be a hero to the right, this is not true for this growing conspiracist fringe that really read a lot about Iran-Contra and believe it shows that no matter who is president, he's part of what they call the New World Order. All right. So here's a quote from Senator Daniel Inouye, who was on the investigating committee for Iran-Contra. He said that it showed a shadowy government with its own Air Force, its own Navy, its own fundraising mechanism, and the ability to pursue its own ideas of the national interest, free from all checks and balances and free from the law itself. Right. Another scandal coming out of Iran-Contra that lasts until the 1990s has to do with drug smuggling. And here is a picture of the reporter Gary Webb, who worked for the San Jose Mercury News, who in the mid-90s followed up on Iran-Contra with his story about the Contras dealing drugs in California. And a lot of people made a leap from this story. They looked at Gary Webb's undeniable evidence of CIA officials looking the other way while the Contras brought drugs into the United States, and then made a leap and said, and therefore the CIA was deliberately bringing drugs into the United States and using them to pacify the black community. All right, so this takes us through the 1990s, and then of course, there's 9/11 in the 21st century. Now again, intelligence failures always lead to conspiracy theories in US history. So immediately, like within an hour after the towers fell, you can look at the Internet Archive and see examples of people posting conspiracy theories about it. So that's not surprising. People are always going to believe these theories. But what happens is these theories get more widespread. They get a lot more support over the next couple of years. First of all, because of the US invasion of Iraq. And when that starts to go badly, people start to make connections and say, why did we go into Iraq? Was the Bush administration lying about that? And if they were lying about the war in Iraq, did they lie about the 9/11 attacks? And then also, as the 9/11 Commission makes its investigation, documents are released, again, real government documents, that show that the Bush administration did have warnings that Osama bin Laden was going to strike in the United States. And so this is big news in 2004. The Bush administration knew in advance about the 9/11 attacks. And so once again, you have this undeniable evidence and then the leap into the unbelievable. Okay, they were briefed. They wanted to use this to go to war in Iraq. Did they do 9/11 themselves? In particular, there are more and more theories by 2006, 2007, that the towers actually did not fall because they were hit by airplanes, but because there was a controlled demolition, and that the headquarters was in another building in the WTC Center. Okay, so this is what this trust in government index looks like. You can see right here, the reason I wanted to show you this again is that you can see that in 2001 with the 9/11 attacks, and it starts to go up again, but then it falls, and it continues now at this low level. Okay, so now we get to our current political situation, right? So I would argue that you cannot understand the rise of Donald Trump, the success of Donald Trump, without understanding this history of anti-government conspiracy theories and the way they have become more and more widespread since the 1960s. This helps explain how a candidate who spread so many conspiracy theories, who endorsed so many conspiracy theories himself, could win the nomination of a major party and then win the election. So Trump gets started in politics, presidential politics, with a conspiracy theory. In 2011, he starts to consider running against Obama in 2012. And so he starts going on lots of TV shows and spreading a conspiracy theory that Barack Obama was not born in the United States and therefore is not eligible to be president. Right? And he continues spreading this up until, as you know, during the campaign last year. Right? So in addition, he starts implying that Obama is also secretly Muslim. He says at various points during the campaign that you cannot trust anything that Obama says, that Obama was lying about the unemployment rate, which Trump says is actually 42%, that he was lying about the number of refugees in the country, and that most significantly, that he was, that Obama was going to rig the election for the Democrats, and thus really destroying the faith of his supporters in the integrity of the electoral process. And this is in addition to other political conspiracy theories like climate change is a hoax and vaccinations cause autism. Now, this is perhaps my own personal favorite of the conspiracy theories that he advocated during the campaign, is that this blurry picture of a man next to Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans in 1963 is actually the father of Ted Cruz. All right. Now, one of the most telling aspects of Trump's conspiracism, I think, is his embrace of the extreme right-wing conspiracist fringe. This is Alex Jones. Alex Jones got his start in Texas in the mid-1990s. First of all, as a on the radio. First of all, on public access television, and then on the radio. And he began early in his career getting a lot of attention by saying that the Oklahoma City bombing was actually a government false flag operation, that the government blew up its own building in order, as a part of a plot to take away Americans' guns. And then he continues with many, many different conspiracy theories over the years, most notoriously recently by saying that the Sandy Hook Elementary School massacre was also a government false flag operation. Now, he has a YouTube channel that has 700,000 subscribers. If you look at his documentaries on YouTube, there are tens of millions of views of them. He has a big following. And in December 2015, Donald Trump appeared on Alex Jones's show and complimented Jones and said he was amazing. After the election, according to Jones, President-elect Trump called up Jones and told him to thank his followers for him and said he would be on the show in the future, although that has not happened. Right? So this is really unprecedented for a presidential candidate, for a president, to embrace someone who's so clearly a member of the conspiracist fringe. Right? And I think in order to understand that, you have to look at this chart, look at how low this number is now, and also, of course, to look at the failure of trust in media as well. You know, the numbers on this are not as good as the numbers in trust in government, but you can find examples of one question that was asked in 1972, 74, 76, and then asked every two years starting in 1997. Right? And this is, do you trust the media to report the news fairly most of the time? And what's interesting here is if you look at this number in the 70s, remember this is when trust in government is collapsing. But look, Americans still trust the media in the 70s. They don't trust government, but they trust the media to watch government. They trust the watchdogs. But then, as you can see, starting in the 90s, it starts to slide. Although even 10 years ago, more than half of Americans said they trusted the media. Last year, it was 32%. And among Republicans, it's much lower than that. Right? So if you can't trust anything the government says, if you think the government's always lying, if you can't trust anything you read in the mainstream media, then that sets you up in a position where you can claim alternative facts. Mm-hmm. This is something that Donald Trump said back in March of 2016. I don't know. What do I know about it? All I know is what's on the internet. I think this is what a lot of people, not just his followers, are saying these days. I read it on the internet, therefore it is true. There's not the investigation of sources that there could be. So what can we do? Well, there are sites where if you hear something that you're suspicious about, you can go and look. And they have lots of links and investigations into the truth of these rumors or conspiracy theories. PolitiFact and FactCheck and Snopes.com are all very good. PolitiFact, I think, is particularly good with the graphics, where if it's really a lie, they have this pants on fire graphic. So you can't be confused about whether they think it's right or wrong. Now, I want to conclude by giving you a couple of my favorite quotes about conspiracy theories. One is by the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. He said, "You're entitled to your own opinion, but you are not entitled to your own facts." And another is by Thomas Pynchon, who said, "If they can get you asking the wrong questions, they don't have to worry about answers." And I think both of those have a lot for us to ponder these days. You're not entitled to your own facts. You're entitled to investigate the facts and then have your own opinion about them. And also, if they get us asking the wrong questions, then they don't have to give us the answer to things that really matter. So that's what I would encourage you to do, is to continue to investigate, to be skeptical citizens, but not cynical ones, right? To hold the government accountable, but not just lapse into complete cynicism. Oh, they all lie. It doesn't matter. To be skeptical, to hold the government accountable, and to ask the right questions.